Welcome to this new automotive news video, the first one of the weekend. Today is June 27, 2026, and today we're going to talk about Renault, which is finally going to fix the biggest flaw of its Renault 5 and Renault 4. About CATL, a huge Chinese electric car battery company that succeeded where Porsche failed. About the French government, which is still unable to reach an agreement with other European countries on the future of electric cars. And about Polestar, the famous electric car brand that once belonged to Volvo, which is now simply banned from being sold. I hope this Saturday's topics will interest you. If that's the case, as usual, I'm counting on you to show it by leaving a like on this video, subscribing for the next ones, and boosting this one. If you see the option, that's the best way to boost the video's ranking. Also, leave a comment with your thoughts on today's news. For months, that was probably the most common criticism about the Renault 4 and Renault 5 electric cars. A range considered too low, not versatile enough compared to competitors who are advancing very quickly. Renault finally appears to be listening to its customers. Previously, the Renault 5 and Renault 4 electric models came with 2 engine options and 2 battery choices. The first was a 120 horsepower engine with a 40 kilowatt-hour battery called the Urban Range versions, and it allowed these models to offer about 300 kilometers of range. And the second version was the Comfort Range versions, a bit more powerful with 148 horsepower, and, most importantly, equipped with a slightly larger battery, a 52 kilowatt-hour battery that allowed these models to offer about 400 kilometers of range. Actually, the Renault 5 Electric is a bit more efficient than the Renault 4 since it's smaller, lighter, and uses less energy. A rather low range, but still acceptable in 2024 at a time when the competition simply had nothing better to offer. Except that the competition quickly caught up. Volkswagen is about to launch its new electric Polo with a range of 450 kilometers. Skoda is going to launch the e-Pick with about 440 kilometers of range. Not to mention all the Chinese brands that may not necessarily offer much more range, but do offer very comparable ranges at much lower prices. Renault had to find an answer to this threat, and they found it by optimizing several key components of the powertrain in the Renault 5 and the electric Renault 4, especially the inverter and the reduction gear. They managed to develop a new technical solution that either improves energy efficiency, basically consuming less to boost the all-electric range of these cars, or enhances their performance to offer a bit more power depending on the driving conditions. Even though Renault hasn't given more details about the technical modifications, we know that this solution should allow for an increase of between 3 and 8% in range depending on the version, the powertrain, and the battery. This should allow them, without changing the battery or the entire system, to gain between 10 and 30 kilometers of range, again depending on the powertrains and the models involved. For your information, this new generation of motors is already being used at Renault. The renowned Gen 2 Evo motors debuted in the new electric Twingo, but their true potential remains unknown since they're electronically limited to 80 horsepower in this model. They're also paired with a much smaller 27 kilowatt-hour battery, which naturally provides less range. These new improved versions of the Renault 5 and Renault 4 will arrive at the end of 2026 or the beginning of 2027, depending on the model, version, and market. Since they won't be available everywhere at the same time in all European countries, let's hope that Renault, by increasing the range of its electric cars, doesn't decide to raise the prices for these new generations. By the way, since we're talking about batteries, let's talk about CATL, a huge Chinese electric car battery company, the world leader that succeeded where Porsche failed. Indeed, Porsche, as well as a whole bunch of other sports car brands like Lotus, for example, or even Alpine, have had a lot of difficulties and sometimes even completely abandoned the project to develop electric sports cars for the simple reason that with the previous generation of batteries, it was impossible to offer an electric car that was both high-performing, had good range, and had sporty handling. That's why Lotus gave up on the idea of making an electric Elise, and also why Porsche took so long and ended up several years behind in developing its electric Porsche Cayman models. CATL managed to develop a new type of battery designed for sports cars which have a much smaller profile. In concrete terms, batteries that are much shorter and also much lighter, which would solve 2 problems at once: both the weight issue of potential electric sports cars and their size problem. Because a very large car has more wind resistance, which means worse performance and potentially also worse range. Currently, a battery is made up of relatively thick prismatic cells. As a result, manufacturers are forced to increase the thickness of their car's floor. The direct consequence is that either cars are made taller, or manufacturers decide to keep their height and sacrifice interior space. CATL claims to have found a solution by modifying the architecture of these cells. The engineers created a hand-sized area directly under the cover of the electrical terminals. This makes it easier to fold the internal tabs of the electrodes without them touching the metal walls of the cell. Otherwise, as you can imagine, that would pose a major safety risk. This lets you lower the battery height and prevent micro short circuits from vibrations or heavy road stress, an innovation that should allow future electric cars to gain between 2 and 4 centimeters in height. It's not a huge amount, but it's a step in the right direction. And maybe if this had existed a few years ago, Porsche would have already released its electric Cayman with a CATL battery a long time ago. While some are preparing for the future, others are simply fighting for the right to exist and to sell their cars. That's the case for Polestar, indeed. The United States has simply just banned Polestar from selling its cars on their territory. For several years, Washington has quietly prepared new regulations targeting cars of Chinese brands or those owned by Chinese groups. Remember, we talked about this law briefly a few days ago. Because Mercedes is partly a Chinese-owned brand, and could also end up being banned from sale in the United States. The argument put forward is that Chinese cars or cars from Chinese groups are generally equipped with Chinese equipment and Chinese technology, and the American government suspects these Chinese brands of being able, through their various equipment, to collect sensitive information about Americans, but also about strategic sites. For example, collecting different data near sensitive areas like military bases, using sensors or cameras, which could then be retrieved by the Chinese to be exploited. It might sound a bit far-fetched, but the United States takes these kinds of threats very seriously. And that's the direct reason why Polestar is now banned. Polestar is part of the Geely group, which is why it's targeted by the United States. Since Geely is Chinese, Polestar will no longer be allowed to sell its cars in the United States starting in 2026, even though these cars are actually manufactured in American factories. First, this is a tough blow for Polestar. While the US isn't its main market, it's still made up about 10% of sales, which is significant. This calls into question all of Geely Group's international ambitions because, believe it or not, other brands owned by Geely, like Lotus or Volvo, are also at risk. They've obtained an exemption that allows them to keep selling cars until 2027, giving them a one-year reprieve to become compliant. But if they don't manage to do it by 2027, they could be banned, just like Mercedes or even Polestar. Today, the future of the automobile is decided not just by car manufacturers or dealerships, but also by government offices. And in France, we can't reach a consensus with the other European Union countries regarding the future of electric and internal combustion cars, while the entire French and European automotive industry is dying. Every day we hear about new layoff plans, production line closures, and factory shutdowns. Remember, just a few days ago, Volkswagen announced 100,000 layoffs, and that's just one example among many others. While the entire sector is dying, the European Commission can't reach a consensus regarding the future of the automotive industry. Even though the situation is really urgent, there was yet another meeting held on June 25, 2026. The European environment ministers met in Luxembourg to negotiate the future of the automotive industry. But since no one can agree, and since no one wants to face reality, well, not many people, we find ourselves in an inextricable situation where, well, the European Commission isn't changing anything and the manufacturers are just flying blind. Quite simply, remember, at the end of 2025, the European Commission had already proposed to relax the rules regarding CO2 emissions so that manufacturers can continue to offer new combustion engine cars after 2035 in small numbers, of course, 10 instead of 0, a kind of half measure that satisfies no one since Germany still considers it's not enough. It should likely be heard first since it has Europe's biggest automotive industry and is being influenced by Italy and several Eastern European countries, who believe that indeed more room should be given to combustion engines and more room to other solutions besides electric. After 2035, to put it simply, this bloc is asking for more room for renewable fuels, more room for hybrid cars. It refuses to let big companies be forced to buy electric cars, and it also rejects the CO2 supercredit mechanism that Brussels wanted to implement to encourage the production and sale of very small electric city cars. On the other side, France and Spain form another bloc, which rejects the adjustments proposed by the European Commission for the end of 2025 and which outright rejects all the requests from the opposing side. The problem with all this isn't whether we agree with one side or the other. The problem is that in the meantime, nothing can move forward. For manufacturers, they're waiting for clarity to know which cars they can sell and build before investing. Nothing has changed in 6 months. Manufacturers and the European Commission have spent 6 months trying to agree on Made in Europe. They've spent 6 months debating whether to keep selling combustion engines after 2035. For 6 months, we've heard about CO2 supercredits for electric city cars, but nothing has changed. The situation seems completely stuck. And as long as decisions aren't made, uncertainty prevails. The manufacturers are flying blind and can't plan anything long-term. So this whole thing looks complicated. In the meantime, anyway, that's it for today's news. I hope you found the video interesting. If that's the case, Cash is counting on you to show your support. Like, subscribe for upcoming videos and consider supporting via the join button below. See you tomorrow for the week's last video. Good luck, have a great day, ciao.